Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Erica Strohmeyer, and I'm an urban planner and project manager for SERA Architects, and I'm based out of our Oakland office. These other lovely faces that you're seeing on the screen are our three amazing panelists. We first have Megan G. from ARUP San Francisco. Megan is a transportation planner, and she's got amazing experience in both the United States and in Australia. Next, we have Craig Schaumburg from Toole Design in Seattle. Craig is a transportation engineer who works at both the project and guideline levels across the United States. And last but not least, we have Chris Hwang from Oakland Bike Oakland. And Chris comes to us with an extensive background in bicycle and pedestrian advocacy. We really want to thank you all for taking the time today to join our panel discussion about active mobility in the time of COVID. We anticipate that the discussion should last for roughly 90 minutes, and I'm just going to give you guys a quick overview on how all of this is going to work. We're going to start with some short statements about key observations and thoughts that we've all had on anything and everything active mobility while under shelter in place for the past few months. And then I'm going to move into asking some questions about specific subtopics of active mobility. These questions were generated in a way to elicit a conversation amongst the panel rather than kind of your standard Q&A format. We'll likely wrap up with the prepared discussion piece around 5 p.m. or so, and then I'm going to turn it over to questions and answers from all of you who are attending this discussion. So, in order to submit a question for consideration, I want to point your direction to the Q&A panel that's along the right-hand side of your screen. You do not need to wait for the open question and answer session of this discussion to begin. You can submit your questions actually in there at any time. And if you see that somebody has actually entered a question in that you would also like to hear about, you have the option to upvote that question. And you can do so by clicking upvote directly underneath the question that you like. I hope that all makes sense. If it doesn't, you can actually ask some questions in the Q&A panel right now. And I have 3 administrators on call that can help answer those questions for you to the best of their abilities. Okay, now I'm going to kick this off by providing a quick overview of my thoughts and observations over the past few months, and then I'm going to turn it over to our panelists. So, many of my original observations while sheltering in place really centered around the massive uptick in runners, cyclists, skateboarders, and even rollerbladers that I've ever noticed before in my life. I started discussing this with friends and family, and I learned that many of the people close to me that traditionally would never get out of their cars had been changing their habits to adjust to the fact that they were not commuting, they were not going to the gym, and they were just really wanting to get as much fresh air as possible. And then through these conversations, I learned that they were loving their new habits and they wanted to keep those up even when they started to return to a more type of normal routine. Then as things evolved, and as we learned about the tragic deaths of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd, my thoughts started to shift focus. I started thinking about the safety of citizens who are out biking and running, and obviously not just safety from a public health perspective, but safety from a racial and equity perspective. Then I started to think about how I could connect all of the sustainable placemaking values that we have at SERA Architects with the concept of creating healthy and safe public spaces that will need to accommodate for social distancing and will be equitably distributed amongst our communities. These public spaces would need to be designed for all citizens without making assumptions for what we believe is best for lower income communities or for communities of color. It was these thoughts that led me to reach out to my friends, to my colleagues, and to other people that I know in the urban planning and transportation industry to join me in discussing this in a public format. And that leads us to where we are today. So I am going to turn things over to Megan G, and I'm going to pop up some slides for her now.
Thanks, Erica.
Oh, I don't think they're popping up.
No.
Hold on. Oopsies.
One thing I've noticed is technical challenges. I'm sure everybody is in the same boat. Can you see the slides? Okay, great. So I just had some photos from my wanderings around my neighborhood and further afield. Some of you will have seen these kind of things in your cities. The Slow Streets initiative that has been rolled out in places like Oakland and San Francisco has been an effort for the city to try and reclaim some space for humans in places where they need access to larger spaces to recreate and exist in their neighborhoods. So I've seen a bit of this. One of the more encouraging things is seeing parents riding with their kids on these streets, but definitely it's not the only thing. I've seen empty freeways. I've seen people brute forcing their infrastructure to work for them in a way that was never designed. I think this is an incredibly encouraging picture, thinking about the way infrastructure is developed. It is actually a reflection of the physical manifestation of our societal values. And when you think about things like freeways, they have been designed for the ease of people most likely in the 1950s. And we still have some relics of that today. That is to say, they are designed for whiteness, masculinity primarily, and capitalism to thrive. It doesn't necessarily take account of everybody's needs in the streets. So when I say brute forcing the infrastructure to work for us, we're talking about people taking back the streets, using their own way of doing that, whatever that means. We've also got people with prams and everything on JFK Drive. I think this was before they actually closed it, so people were still doing that, whether or not they should technically do it. But thinking about the way that we could possibly reconsider infrastructure priorities to be more geared towards the things that we value today, rather than specifically thinking about the people in the past and what their values reflected. I will pass it on to Craig next, I think. That's, yeah, and I'll move back to the camera.
Cool. You can hear me okay? All right. So my name is Craig Schaumburg, and I'm a civil engineer with Toole Design. And in case people aren't familiar with Toole Design, just real quick, Jennifer Toole started Toole Design in 2003 with a simple mission to support innovative streets and dynamic communities where people of all ages and abilities can enjoy walking, biking, and access to transit. And today we have 17 offices throughout North America with planners, engineers, and landscape architects working on every aspect of active mobility. I'm actually based in our Seattle office, and I'm actually in our Seattle office right now because my Wi-Fi in my apartment is dead. But I work on a variety of different types of projects: design guidance, conceptual design, and construction documents throughout the country, mostly on the West Coast. So the COVID-19 pandemic it's unlike anything that I've ever lived through. It's upended the lives of people all over the world through the requirements to stay at home and keep distance from others. And it has resulted in unprecedented economic hardship in this country, in the United States, while making the underlying inequities in our cities very plain for everyone to see. Some folks at Toole Design have been talking this week about a similar panel, similar to this one that happened last week, where one of my colleagues, who is a person of color, participated. Some of the things that I've been hearing around the office, around the chat logs, is why was she the only person of color on that panel? Why were the equity questions directed to her alone? And why are we even talking about things like this right now when we see protests on our streets? And honestly, these are the same questions that I've been struggling with as I prepared for this panel. When the pandemic hit, these weren't my first thoughts. My first thought wasn't, how this is affecting communities of color disproportionately. And my first thought about street closures wasn't how they might be thought of differently in communities of color. Actually, when I was invited to be a part of this panel, my first thought wasn't how I could contribute to a diverse perspective. And I didn't ask how many people of color would be on this panel. And so, at this moment, it's embarrassing to me that I didn't think to ask those things. And I think it just is plainly indicative of my privileged place in society. What's interesting to me personally is that I had prided myself on my knowledge of historical inequities in this country. I've read a lot about redlining and gentrification, even about the Civil War and the Reconstruction era. But then I was still unable to ask these questions or consider these questions leading up to this time. So I think the lesson here for me and for everyone is that you can know all the history in the world, but if you're not using that to understand how people are affected today, and if you're not acting on that, then you're actually hindering change. So the preparation leading up to this discussion has been just a good opportunity for me personally to grow and professionally to grow. And for that reason alone, I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to have worked on preparation for this. And I think that we can all do better moving forward. The one thing that I want to say about this time that is sort of captivating to me, you know, I first heard about some of these cities that are in India, these cities that are, you know, some of the most polluted cities in the world, where people are actually seeing the Himalaya mountains for the first time in their lives. And this is, I mean, this is an amazing thought, but and you know, problems of climate change and air pollution are very interesting things, and very much things that I care a lot about. But what's super captivating about this is that actually everyone is seeing the world anew in some way at this time. Everyone is dealing with the pandemic in some way right now, and everyone's reality is shifting a little bit, and you're maybe seeing things that you didn't see before. Maybe not like mountains, but you know, some other things. So as an example, I think some people are you know, as Erica said, some people are being reintroduced to the simplicity and advantages of walking and bicycling. Some people are just being reintroduced to the neighborhood scale of their city, a place that maybe they didn't spend a lot of time actually before. Some people are avoiding long commutes, spending more time with family. But there's also a lot of not positive things that are happening right now. There's a lot of people who are confined to neighborhoods that lack basic services, that don't allow them to walk and bike in a way that others can. And transit, you know, transit use that is desperately relied upon in a lot of places is reduced at this time. So I just consider this to be an invaluable time that we as designers, as community advocates, as people who are working on projects that are in the right of way, we need to capitalize on this time. We need to be asking, you know, use this time to ask direct questions to the community. Questions like, what did you learn about what you need during this time? What would make your life better? In many cases, things that seemed impossible not so long ago, they don't seem impossible now. And you know, it feels like some of these barriers were actually artificial. So I propose that, and what I'm excited about is that we can use this opportunity to create an equitable society, and that this, in our industry, the industry that you know, we all work in, we have a place in all of this too, by asking these questions, by listening, by elevating the existing voices in the community, and by working to increase the diversity in our own places of work. So that's what I'm excited about.
Thanks, Craig. All right, we're going to go on over to Chris.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining this call. My name is Chris Hwang. I'm the board president of Oakland Bike Oakland. We've been around since 2007, advocating for great streets for walking and bicycling, and while doing that, solving some of our community's most complicated problems about sustainability, livability, and safe access. So, but one thing to note is, you know, WOBO's vision is that every person who lives, plays, and works in Oakland feels safe and comfortable walking and bicycling. But also the second component being, I think, equally important is that people know how to make their neighborhoods a better place to walk and bike. I think that second component is a critically important piece to make a person feel like a whole person, to feel the efficacy and the ability to make change in their world. That's really important because I'm here to speak as an advocate and an activist, where I feel like my role is threefold. It's to observe, to listen, and then to translate these things into actions. So first of all, it's just having clarity through observing what's happening around us, giving ourselves some time and space to do that, and then to listen to how people are experiencing the moment, and how it's affecting them and how it's affecting the people around them. And then translating and associating what we're observing and hearing into some associated actions, but also acknowledging that how people feel are absolutely within some historical context or some present experience. So given those three roles, I think what is also sometimes missing from the conversation is who are we listening to? Because depending on who you're listening to, you might have a change of heart of what you actually advocate for. So I'll give you two very simple examples. In this time of COVID, let's just say, if I was listening to myself, I have an office job, I'm sheltering in place, I'm getting antsy, I can't run errands, the streets are super quiet, I want to go out there. What did I do in the last month? I went out and bought myself an e-bike. It's a little present to myself. The other example is my niece. She's a mother of three, lives in East Oakland. School's canceled, so it's basketball camp. Libraries are closed, and she does not have a bicycle network or a walkable route to a store. So I, as an auntie, bought her a car. Yes, I am a walking and bicycling advocate. But I think it's important how we define the situation. This COVID pandemic usually is defined as a public health pandemic. It's a public health crisis. But what we're seeing also in the last 10, 11 days is it's shining a light on the disproportionality of the impact of a lot of our systems that are inherently racist, inherently anti-Black. And it's showing up in morbidity and mortality rates. It's also a data point that hasn't changed that much over time. So if we're looking at historical records and data trends of morbidity and mortality, it's always been worse for people of color. So this is, I think, a call for action to be a bit clear about how we frame and shape and acknowledge the problem that we're trying to solve. I think in the last few months, it's been kind of fun to watch social media and see what's happening in Paris, what's happening in Spain. And we're salivating over, the 74 miles of slow streets that are implemented in Oakland, and then here in New York City, up to 100 miles in New York City, and Seattle making things permanent. What I'm observing is not so much of the what is gonna be the outcome or the output of this action during this time of COVID, but the level of political will that we suddenly found to do things differently. We gotta challenge that, because this is a time to look at our streets differently, look at mobility differently, but perhaps while we're at it, we should be taking on that same level of political will to solve bigger, broader issues. So I'll leave it at that. The other component is also, I'm not a transportation planner. I'm a public health advocate. I'm a data researcher person. I do evaluations for a living in the education field. Once we essentialize what we're experiencing as a mobility issue, you start tapping into what we traditionally rely on as a transportation solution. We're looking towards transportation to solve really big issues. And what I have observed over time is, in the last 6-7 weeks, is that it's got to be an all hands on deck. You got to call up people in economic development, people in emergency services, in violence prevention and race inequity. You got to call up the artists, you got to call up the culturalists, the business owners, the mom and pop shop owners. Many, many people need to be part of that conversation because it's about them. And so part of my contribution to this conversation is to perhaps think about what else we can do outside of that transportation world and perhaps define the problem a little bit differently. And that makes advocacy and being an activist a unique role in finding our path forward.
Thank you. Thanks so much to all you guys for your statements. Really appreciate it. We're going to roll into some of our questions. And for this first question, I'll go to you guys individually kind of for responses, but I want you to feel free to play off of, the responses that you're hearing from everybody else, and then we'll be a little bit more free flow in the other questions. So first question is, why is it still important to discuss active mobility at this time when we continue to deal with a pandemic and we see massive demonstrations on the streets of our cities seeming to indicate bigger problems? We're going to start with Megan, and then we're going to go to Chris and Craig with this one. Megan.
Yeah, what a thorny issue. It's really incredibly important that we consider this question right up front, and I'm glad we're talking about it. The thing is, streets and design and infrastructure have always been used as tools of oppression and division. If you think back to redlining, or you consider people like Robert Moses in their patriarchal wisdom intending to do well by the community by flattening neighborhoods of color to create freeways, these places have always been a site of division and oppression for oppressed communities. The people who are making the decisions about these pieces of our city have always been people in positions of power, and the decisions that get made rarely include people who will need the most from these from this infrastructure. So when we're looking at things like protests on the streets, one of the first things the police can do is put up barricades. They can say, no, you cannot take over this street. This street is too important for movement of cars, that we can't possibly close it for your protest, or we'll call this illegal. If it's not the right time to talk about this, then it never is. I think it's always going to be the right time to talk about creating a more equitable environment for us to all move in these spaces. I really think that equity is fundamental in transportation, must continue to be, and will still needs to be considered as more fundamental to the work we do. But I really think it hasn't been in the past. And although transportation cannot be expected to solve everything, it's also really fundamental to how everybody lives their lives, and it reinforces so many existing inequities, and it separates us as a community. So I really think, yes, it's important to discuss this topic now. It's important to frame it in this context, and it's critical that we consider everybody that needs to use these spaces equally.
All right, Chris.
Yeah, I don't know if I have anything to add to that other than the fact that I do think acknowledging that the road space or the public space is used for a lot of purposes, and when you layer onto that the kind of power that you can usurp by controlling public space, for example, for our unhoused community, the power that you wield over our community, our in-house community, by clearing homeless encampments, that's power, and the way you control movement by building highways, or basically state routes that are 8 lanes wide, that encircles a community around a 1 mile block. You're basically imprisoning a particular community to a certain reality. So I think working on mobility issues is, it's a very powerful platform. It's also a very easy way to engage in the community around the concepts of how they experience the space. It's not complicated. It's actually, people can be really very real and very honest to you about how they experience the space. And I think the key is to hear and listen to what they have to say, and then turning that into something that can at least change the direction of how we use our power in the public space.
I want to repeat something that Chris said at the beginning in her intro, is that we're in an all hands on deck moment. And so I think it would be a mistake for us to think that in this industry we don't have impact in these areas, because we do. And I think that a lot of people in the transportation urban design world don't think about that, don't think about the impact that they have. Even in terms of just hiring practices and working toward having a diverse place of work. I mean, if all you have are white voices, then you may not think there's a problem. So we all have a part to play. I also know, many people have said that transportation mobility equals economic mobility. The ability for people to get around a city in a connected way on public transit or walking and biking is very important for access to goods and services. And so these things are intertwined. I think when I started working in transportation engineering, which I did not start my career in, I didn't appreciate how connected everything was. And at a certain point, I thought, oh my gosh, we're all just working on land use. Everything is land use. That's it. So I'm working in this little piece of that, but it's all part of one ecosystem, which is the city. So we have to all get on board on this, or we can't create change.
May I add just a little, speaking of land use, there is another side to this, which you sort of alluded to at the start, Craig, about the suburbanization of poverty and the suburbanization of gender. And this is something we've been studying at my company. We're very fortunate we get research allocation every year that we can apply to do some projects. And we've done a project on designing cities for women, and it became very clear that what we have is a divide between people who do have mobility, and the supply of monetary stimulus for that activity is definitely geared towards the 9 to 5 model of working. And anybody who doesn't really fit into that, anybody who works on a reduced schedule, or they work in shift work, or if they stay at home with the kids, they have significantly fewer opportunities, and they can be landlocked. They either make way more trips than most people, or 0 trips. And what I think everybody's suddenly realizing is that they are stuck at home. Suddenly going to the grocery store becomes a huge ordeal. And if you've always driven for every trip that you do, then it's no longer just a small thing. And realizing that these places that are not well connected for walking and biking, it is actually a real impediment to your well-being. And I think we're just starting to realize, a lot of people are just starting to find themselves understanding their neighborhood very differently, and understanding what walkability can bring in terms of value.
And I can't remember who said it earlier. It might have been you, Megan, but also talking about exploring our neighborhoods in a way that we never had before. I definitely know, I mean, aside from everything else that I've noticed about active mobility while under shelter in place, I've noticed how it's good for my mental health as well. And I think that for a lot of people who don't have access in general to various resources for mental health, or who typically do have those resources and can't access them right now, that there has been a lot of good coming out of people that can get outside and do have access to trails where they can be in touch with nature. And that is something that has meant so much to me, that it's made me think that people that don't have that access for whatever reason, that they are missing out on something that is just essential to being a human. And it's really important for us to make sure that everybody has access fairly.
Yeah. I'll note that one, just tagging off of that thought, is one of the things, because I have worked in the public health field for so long, one of the things that I was actually kind of pining for was public health to take a stronger stance around the role that it has in ameliorating the negative impacts on sheltering in place, on mental health. On the inability to maintain social connections, especially in the communities where you do rely on visiting each other for your own emotional resilience. And I just felt that lacking. And it, you know, at the same time, the big public health message was socially distance. I mean, that, or, you know, maintain physical distance, don't go to the parks. As a matter of fact, one of the solutions that the advocacy groups had asked for was for more space for people to congregate at Lake Merritt, which is an amazing place. Everybody wants to go there. A lot of communities and neighbors go to Lake Merritt in order to get out. And so one of the things that that we had a little bit of pushback around opening up space around Lake Merritt, because they didn't want people to socially gather. I can see why. There are lots of reasons, but again, there are also lots of ways to problem solve around, you know, what we really need as human beings in order to thrive.
All right, I'm going to move on to our second question. And Chris, I have you, you're going to kick off the answer on this one. But this is cycling back to slow streets, which have been mentioned in some of our opening remarks. But we see cities closing streets both on a temporary or a permanent basis to motor vehicle through traffic, which is also referred to as slow streets. Have these slow streets been equitably distributed across our cities? How have they been working? And is this all that we can do?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So in the city of Oakland, there was a declaration that 74 miles of roadways that were identified in the bike plan as part of the bicycle network, current and future bike network, would become slow streets. And it was actually, in technical terms, it was an equally deployed plan where all 74 miles would get the same treatment. So the treatment was that we would roll out certain street segments with A-frames and signage on there that noted that there would be no through traffic, encouraging only people who resided in those blocks to use that as their throughway. It was 48 hours between the announcement of this project to the first rollout, and WOBO being sort of like a, you know, we thrive on volunteer work. We gathered volunteers to help with the postering, putting signs up, letting people know what it is and what it isn't. The mayor was very clear that that slow streets would not be enforced. So taking out the element of policing out of the project. And that was important to recognize. The ultimate goal was, giving people extra space so that they can go into the street to stretch their legs, to do some recreational activities, to be able to move about safely in the street. So what we're really talking about isn't an equitable rollout. It was an equal rollout. It was the assumption that you do the same thing and you've got to do this across the region, and for very good reasons, that the bike network is across the city of Oakland and across most of the neighborhoods. And it was important to declare that you were going to do something for the entire city of Oakland rather than just for little pockets of neighborhoods. I think at the time of rollout, many of us had already anticipated that there's going to be very different reactions to slow streets. There's some streets where you literally see 3-year-olds on their scoots in the middle of the roadway. Like, I don't know which adult on the street is their guardian, but they are just rolling along. And people have come out of the doorways and say, oh my God, this is amazing. I've been waiting for this for 15 years. Can they do this permanently? And then you go to other neighborhoods where there is just not a single person on the roadway. It is, barricades are still there, or someone's driven over it, or people have removed the barricades overnight. So there are unequal experiences, and I think that it's also just recognizing that different neighborhoods have different experiences with the roadway. They associate it with different things, and the roadways are used for different purposes. So an equal treatment for very different contexts is going to yield very different results. And as a matter of fact, to be really honest, some of our community members did not like it. They felt that it was an imposition of their need to use the roadways to drive to locations, to essential services. And so there are lots and lots of different elements. I mean, there are also lots of lessons to be learned, and I would give props to our Department of Transportation in that they are trying to react to the feedback. As a matter of fact, lesson learned is that you should put out as many opportunities for feedback while you are implementing projects as much as you can. And even in a survey, by the way, online surveys are very much geared towards the white, privileged, connected audience. So we did also look at who was responding to the surveys, and they were primarily higher income communities and white members of our community. So, so with that knowledge, we are actually spending more time on the ground or signing up for phone check-in surveys with folks in different parts of the city. So yes, I think we are evolving, we are learning, but at the same time, it's also just realizing that an equal deployment of a particular solution is not the same, going to be experienced the same way.
I'll jump in and talk about Seattle for a minute. Seattle is interesting because I don't work for Seattle, but the Seattle Department of Transportation seemed to not take a stance on any street closures for a long time, and then very quickly rolled out a few miles, but within a couple weeks they were up to 20 miles. And very quickly on the heels of that, they were announced to actually be permanent closures, which was interesting because you have to imagine that between the time of it being announced as a temporary closure to the time that it was a permanent closure, there wasn't actually a lot of opportunity to ask folks who live on the street what they thought about that. We concentrated on the neighborhood Greenway network in Seattle. And neighborhood Greenway is what we call bicycle boulevards. So they're like low volume, low speed neighborhood streets that have traffic calming and crossing improvements at large streets. So it made sense to focus on those because those streets were already streets that were not really designed for through motor vehicle traffic anyway. So quite a easy, quick win to put up some barricades there. But I think that the other point about what we've, by concentrating on that network, is that it was only as good as the existing neighborhood greenways that are in Seattle. And you can look at the map of this, and many people have made these comments, but they're not equitably distributed throughout the city. They're primarily thought of as a transportation facility. So actually, I mean, a bicycle boulevard is thought of as a transportation facility for bicyclists. And so they're typically parallel to major roads, and they're typically designed to be an alternative to taking that major road that has higher speed and higher volume. So, you know, they may not be everywhere in the city, and they may actually not go that far into neighborhoods at all because they're out next to the arterials. So I think that it was great to see that action, but at the same time, I think we've built that on the bones of something that was incomplete and flawed to some extent, and I think there's work to be done there. Let's see. The other thing that was really interesting to me, and I think Chris, you kind of mentioned this earlier. I was on another webinar a few weeks ago where I actually heard some folks at SDOT describe that they felt like they were in an arms race with other cities, and it happened to be a joint webinar with Portland staff, and you could kind of tell, and I've heard this before. People are like, "Whoa, Seattle! Like, you permanently close stuff? Wow, that's like, holy crap! I didn't know that anyone was doing that." And I think there's a real danger there, because I do wonder if there's a little bit of like one-upsmanship happening, which just feels inappropriate at this time. I had heard a quote that was attributed to Salita Reynolds, who's the head of LA DOT, and she said that you can't use the pandemic as a permission slip for nonsense, and I feel like that's accurate. So we have this pressure to move fast right now because it feels like a great opportunity, and it also feels like the cars are coming, right? But I think we can't fall into that trap. We need to you know, do the outreach and talk to the people on the street.
I think I would also say, I heard Salita say that. It was fantastic. I would also say that we have to be very careful about telling people what they need from an expertise level. We may be technical experts, we may be advocacy experts, but there are people who have lived experience, expertise that we don't have, and not everybody's going to benefit in the same way from a slow street, and not everybody needs the same answer to their contextual issues, right? So you look at Milan or Paris and say, oh, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could do that? Well, maybe, but also we have to think about what the needs are of the community here. And in places where you are surrounded by freeways, for example, and off-ramps and on-ramps, what use is a slow street? It doesn't necessarily connect you to anything. Can you even get to it? Is it really helping the people it needs to help? We're building on top of something that is not necessarily built for the needs we have today. So we have to be careful about trying to iteratively adapt it. Chris, I think you said something about we're done with iterative. I'm not saying it right. Anyway, we're done with like incrementalism, right? That's the polite way to put it.
I use some bad words too.
I think just trying to incrementally improve on top of something that was not built for us is flawed, and will be even more flawed if we do it too quickly. And I'd say part of the benefit of this is not doing permanent things too fast, and thinking about being flexible in a way that infrastructure hasn't typically been. We can rethink the way that we implement these solutions to be able to evolve with the people in them. Because we've made a lot of assumptions in the past about this is always going to be true. This is how you model traffic. This is how it's going to grow. This is what it's going to need. It's not necessarily going to be true in 20 years.
Yeah, so a lot of the responses that you guys gave actually really tee into the next thing that we wanted to talk about as a team. And the question that we had is, cities are eager to move quickly to make public policy and physical changes, sometimes limiting engagement and communication with local residents. How can the desire to move fast be balanced with the need to communicate and listen to the community? Chris, we had you kicking off the response to this one. I think you were definitely hitting on that in your previous response, but I'm sure you have some insights on this as well.
Yeah, I do think, like, first, I'm torn with a couple of things. One is we do a lot of community engagement. We have a lot of data. I mean, I think it's that we may not be taking the time to use the data in a manner that is helpful for a more inclusive process. There is a lot of data. We spent many years getting to a bike plan, for example. We have many, many years under our belt talking about a pedestrian master plan. And I think that where it becomes an issue is that when you don't have the luxury of time, if you do a poor job of notifying folks that, hey, we're trying something temporarily as a response to a public health emergency, and it's not going to be the answer to the bigger, broader issues that you've brought to the table for years and years and years, you're going to break some trust between the community and the decision makers who actually have to implement the projects. So, and that trust, the distrust is a very, very huge barrier to overcome. So, and I would also say that the quick turnaround also meant that that you didn't have enough time to explain all that stuff. So all this is to say that we actually do under-resource community engagement and the outreach component in many transportation projects. Many transportation projects are also heavily bogged down in a lot of processes of talking to different folks. And I do think that we've got to break out of this mold of, big meetings and then having, a speaker time and things like that. We've got to be more creative about gathering meaningful input. And also, again, it's essentializing transportation issues to just transportation-y kinds of input. When the community says that we have a homelessness problem, we have an illegal dumping problem, and then you have a quick build that is putting A-frames on the street, people are going to be scratching their heads going like, I guess you didn't hear me, or you're just not listening to me. That's a big hurdle. That's a big problem. And it's not for an intentional thing. It's just a matter of like, that is the side effect of working in silos, but also having many years of distrust between the community and what the city has up their sleeves, so to speak.
I just have one very brief thing. I mentioned this to you folks before. There's a fantastic expression, I think it's Hungarian, I heard recently, that says trust arrives on foot and leaves on horse. And we can expect the loss of trust to evaporate. Basically, the trust evaporates very quickly. And also, I would say, when you say we have lots of data, Chris, I think there is a legitimate question about the questions we ask of data. And the whole idea of data-driven requires that we start from an objective premise, and we don't. The setting up of collection of data a lot of the time is not objective. Is driven by people who have an agenda, or at least a perspective.
Just a couple comments along the same line. You know, I've seen this suggested many times over the last few weeks is that we need to put the existing work to work, and I think, you know, that's what Chris is saying, but I think there's like an inherent challenge in that because of what I said in the opening. Like, I do think some people are experiencing their neighborhood in a different way now, and I do think we need to capture that experience, what's happening right now. I think it's very important, but it doesn't mean that we can't go back and look at some of these things that have been done. I mean, I was recently looking at a report in the Duwamish Valley. There's two neighborhoods in the Duwamish Valley in Seattle, Georgetown and South Park, and they have some of the largest health and economic disparities in the city. And what struck me was how expansive the communication and outreach had been over the years in those communities in particular. How many of the community groups they did involve, and I had a project in South Park a few years ago, and so recognizing that, you know, they're talking to a lot of the same groups that I was talking to, and the report just had a lot of actionable goals in it, both short term, medium term, and long term. And so what I think is like we have to be taking those off the shelf right now and starting there, and not assuming that like that's gold. You know, we should go back out there and verify. I mean, it's been some years. Like the same people may not live there anymore, but it's a starting point. We're not starting from zero, and we certainly. So two things with that: we're not starting from zero, so it's not an excuse to go fast because we think that we can't possibly do everything we need to do in a short time period. We can go to this point where we've gotten ourselves to, which is quite far already, and we can look at things like understanding that train noise is a huge problem in Georgetown, and so let's not close a street, even if it's neighborhood Greenway, that happens to be next to trains. You know, I actually don't think that's a real situation in Georgetown, but as an example. And South Park is a neighborhood that has freeways cutting through it. And one of the things in this report in particular said that they don't lack open space in that neighborhood. They just lack the safe means of getting to it because of the freeways. And so you know, that seems like an easy thing that a closed street could help achieve. So yeah, put the work to work resonates with me a lot.
One of the things I was thinking about while you guys were talking, and some of the stuff that I've learned from my colleagues at SERA, really has to do with kind of a tactical urbanism, and not just rolling out a slow streets program, but using the closure of streets and the slow streets program to really kind of play around with those spaces, talk to the citizens who are using those spaces, and figure out what it is that they want in those spaces. Meaning, don't go through a crazy extensive design process where you're going to be spending tons of money doing a ton of community outreach at meetings in the evenings where maybe some people can't get to them, but actually take advantage of the opportunity that's in front of you. Get furniture out there, get, you know, paint out there that can eventually be washed away, other things. Let people kind of identify to you through the use of the various elements that you incorporate in there exactly how they want to use that space for both, you know, just for recreation, for mobility, and for just general understanding of social place. So that's one thing that has been fascinating me. I've seen it a bit in Oakland. We actually ran a trial of something similar to that in Redwood City on a project, and Maybe not everybody will come out and participate, but it's a great way to kick off the conversation and just to see how that community wants to use their space together. Any other comments on this one? You guys want me to jump on over to our final question, and we're going to keep our responses brief on that because it looks like we have some awesome questions in the Q&A that I want to get to, okay? So this question here, and Megan, we're going to have you kick off the answer, is the idea of creating more public space to stay physically apart from each other is great. But how do you equitably design streets that feel safe for everybody, especially with small city and agency budgets and with limited time available to implement such projects to meet current demand?
Right. Easy question. Very, very easy. So I just want to touch on what you spoke about. Co-creation with community is really important. And part of that is about asking the question about who are we creating these spaces for? Like, what does safety actually mean for different people? If you'd spoken to me 2 months ago, I would have been very much on close the freeway ramps because they are terrible for pedestrian and bike safety and they really don't help the freeway function. But when you're thinking about safety in places where people congregate, there are a whole bunch of other elements that are really important. So thinking about, as a woman, feeling safe being in a public space at night, that's a really big issue for women's mobility. But does it get there by policing? Not necessarily. That may make a white woman feel safer, but it definitely doesn't necessarily do the same for women of color or other people of color. We need to change the community attitudes to create safer spaces. But for now, I guess we can do some smaller interventions in the short term, pilot certain things, do community co-creation, bring the physical street back to a human scale through adding extra elements. I mean, we need to listen to people and find out what it is they need to feel safe. And it's not going to be the same everywhere. Keep me brief.
Chris, you want to jump in or me?
Oh, go for it, Greg.
Okay. I think I'm thinking about the smaller budgets thing. You know, I'm working as a consultant and seeing projects being paused, projects that I have no idea if they will come back. You know, I definitely understand that municipalities are struggling with their budget right now, and they're struggling to understand what they're going to prioritize. I think that at least in Seattle, when it comes to closing streets, we actually have a lot of programs to do this already. And they're quite simple in terms of like how you would you know, how you would actually physically close a street. I mean, it's basically what we're doing with our street closures right now. But maybe what's not so simple is that we have so many different programs. Like, do you want a festival street? Do you want a play street? Are you going to have a neighborhood block party? Like, so is it a streetery that you want? You know, like, so these are like a lot of different options that may not be clear, and also may not be being utilized throughout the entire city. There's probably a lot of neighborhoods where they're never utilized. People may not even know that it's a thing. So I think that one of the lessons is that it doesn't cost a lot of money to do these things. Actually, I mean, to do these things. I mean, depending on what we're doing, but to reallocate space in a low cost way does not. It's pretty easy, but reaching all the neighborhoods and helping them understand what the opportunities are, and also asking them what they need, because I actually don't know. I don't know that everyone wants a closed street. I don't know that everyone wants a streetery. You know, I'm just not sure what people want, and I'm just very wary of like. I'm wary. I hear what you're saying, Erica, about like let's do this co-collaboration, and let's get a bunch of things out there and see what works. But there's a very real chance that none of it will work because we brought the wrong stuff, because we didn't ask anyone.
Totally. No, yeah, I get it.
Yeah, I think the example that I think about, and it's an international example, but the first super block in Barcelona, I believe they just asked some grad students to come up with some designs with paint and tires, of all things, like large tires. And it was a total disaster. I mean, the people in the neighborhood hated it. And what I understand to be the turning point in that particular neighborhood was picnic benches, picnic tables, and then I mean, it's been a sea change. People love it now, but you had to find the right thing, and it didn't happen by just asking grad students to like come up with some random stuff.
Yeah. I do think that there are some very low cost solutions that are actually, people do understand what the purpose of these things are. I think for one, every single year we have this thing called National Night Out. It's national, so everybody should know about National Night Out. It literally is permission for people to close down their neighborhood streets. People park cars across, the intersection, and to prevent cars from coming through. And that is understood. And we've got to figure out, like, what goals did that achieve? Is this replicable? And but literally, we have hundreds and hundreds of neighbors who do this once a year. So it's just something to think about. There is some universality around the need to connect and using this very amazing real estate that we have in that's covered in asphalt. That's one piece. And yeah, I do think that there is so much creative energy in Oakland. If there was an opportunity to put out local community-led projects to make streets make cars slow down more, or to have greater pride in the presence, or produce something that people can recognize as the identity of a neighborhood, there are so many artists who just can't wait to jump on that project. So again, it's not the traditional transportation kind of lens solution to the issue, but it's out there. I do still think, like, there are really important investments that are big capital projects that need to go into certain communities to, again, sort of be more equitable in our response to the needs of communities. So to not forget that element, because in some ways, I think some of our communities felt like our Department of Transportation may have been diverting precious resources. We never have enough resources to do things right in our community. Now you suddenly have resources to do 74 miles of street closures. That's just not, it's not a good optic to have out there.
All right. Now I'm looking at the Q&A. I've been communicating with some of our admins on the side. We're going to start with the question from Rick Holt. I think it's an excellent question. It's one thing we haven't touched on as much in this conversation. So I'm just going to read it out to everybody, and then whoever wants to tackle it first, just go for it. What is being done to include children's voices in the design and planning discussion? Children need to be outdoors and active, and they should have a voice in how their built environment is designed. Play, biking, walking, access to public space. Curious to see what your guys' thoughts are on that question.
I guess I can go. I don't have kids, for the record. We are always intending to design for, they say the 8 to 80, but it starts earlier. But first of all, you have to think from being somebody at that height, and you have to consider the possibility that you can't interpret your environment in the same way as an adult who is getting themselves around places. Also thinking about the people who get those kids to those places, which are in the majority women. We need to do better for actually allowing families to have those spaces where they can relax and play, and also even just get to those places in the first place. I think as far as the street design itself, it is really important that we talk to these people, to these tiny humans. We need to actually talk to them and ask them what they want. I think piloting ideas is definitely a good option, but as you said, Craig, it doesn't always necessarily, you don't always bring the right tools for the job on day one, but being flexible and not just trying to drop something in and say, here you go, you're welcome, here's a playground, this is what you wanted, right? I think that's really important.
I guess I'd say that, yeah, I don't have kids either. I don't see kids at a lot of, traditional sort of outreach events. I do think that, I'm not going to say that kids' needs and desires are the exact same as adults, because they're not, but that it is integral to that all ages and abilities, that A to 80 mindset that, is very much focused on connected networks of streets that are safe. So I think that connectivity, when we look at safety studies, that is one of the biggest indicator of increase in safety, and that applies to children as well. If we have safe crossings, that's why it's like you can't fault too much SDOT thinking that the neighborhood greenways is a good place to start, because they've invested in safe crossings at those locations. And while they are, largely parallel to arterials, they were also thoughtfully laid out so that they hit parks and they hit schools along their routes. So, to some degree, they're oftentimes integrated into our Safe Routes to School projects as well. I have one up in my neighborhood right now that is a neighborhood greenway that's being constructed with Safe Routes to School funding, that's adding additional crossings with this in mind. So, I mean, I think that from a transportation standpoint, that should be our largest focus, is the safe and connected networks to these destinations, to these open spaces. Yeah, I'll stop.
Do you have something you'd like to contribute, Chris? You're good. I would like to say a little something. At the beginning of my career, I spent many years working in the public sector, and I participated in, I can't tell you how many community meetings. And one thing you never hear is the voice of a child. These meetings are in the evening. The kids are at home. They're eating dinner. Maybe I would say once every 3 or 4 years, a child would come to the podium and have something to say, or would contribute in a workshop. I think that there are a lot of other ways that we can reach out to children with projects, potentially through schools, or through some sort of means by hitting them through education, because I think that kids think about things simply and adults overthink things. And in a lot of ways, just looking at it simply, just so they can get out on their scooter and they can go buck wild. I mean, that's all they want to do. And how can we design to allow them to do that? Well, I mean, you can obviously watch their behavior, but a lot of kids behave differently. But I would love to find a way to get these questions asked in the classroom or at the schools. I don't know, Chris, if you guys ever do any sort of advocating that way.
No, I think that we do have certain groups in the city of Oakland that focus on safe routes to school and go into the classrooms and solicit feedback from them. But one thing that I'll mention, it's not around children specifically, but around youth. There aren't many spaces for youth to congregate, and I mean, we're talking COVID, but to congregate, to hang out, and that's free. So there are many, there are youth who like to meet up at coffee shops, so you got to buy stuff. And then you have too many youth. If they're youth of color, their activities criminalized, you know, or viewed in a very suspicious way. So I do think that there is room to be very intentional about gathering input from the youth, because they are going to be the users of our roadway. They are, and right now, unfortunately, it's, you know, we have so few high schools, for example, in the city of Oakland, and kids have to be shuttled somehow to their schools. I mean, the idea of walking to your neighborhood school is not even possible. We have a lottery system for school enrollment, so you're not likely to be able to walk 3-4 blocks to your school. So yeah, there are big structural issues to deal with, but also just the idea of being able to hang out with friends is not, it's hard.
I have
Yeah,
one
Megan, go for
really brief thing just to add to that. I thought of a good example I've seen of outreach through play is something I have seen done once, twice, heard of it done more times, but it does help adults reframe their thinking, and it might actually help put adults and kids on a similar platform when you're thinking about doing outreach and engagement, because asking kids to come and stand at a podium is I mean, they might have something great to say, but also, does it get considered at the same weight as everybody else's?
It actually does. You'd be surprised when you get a kid at a podium. People listen. It's because it's so rare.
Well, kids on podiums.
I want to do a quick shout out to Martin's comment, because he's getting a lot of love here in the Q&A. And I do like what he says. He says we need to change our car-centric vocabulary. We should be talking about opening up our streets for pedestrians versus closing our streets for cars. And I think that's great. Yeah, I think we've been talking a lot about closures here, Martin, rather than opening. So I think that's a really good point. Thank you. Next, I'm going to kind of merge a couple of questions here. It looks like, let me make sure, Dave, oops, sorry, hold on. Dave Campbell and Evan Kenward were both asking something similar. I'm going to read Evan's question. In Kirkland, Washington, we are advocating to close park lanes so the restaurants can provide more COVID-friendly outdoor seating. Is this a useful strategy to close more streets to traffic? Megan, I know that you kind of did a little bit of a study on that, so I actually was wondering if you would kick off a response to that.
Sure. In our team, we've been thinking a lot about what would be the best use of our street space under COVID, and thinking about the strain that this has put on small businesses and how challenging it's been for people who work in the service industry. Thinking about getting those places up and running as best we can first is a really critical part of this. So we were looking at how would we reconsider commercial streets, and I have to agree with Martin. I'm all about enabling people rather than saying closing cars. I think it helps us change our viewpoint. I think enabling folks to gather distantly in commercial areas is definitely going to be helpful, and it's not going to look the same. And I keep on saying the same thing, but it's not going to look the same in the Dog Patch compared to Valencia Street, compared to, you know, the Sunset or the Richmond. They all have different needs, different transportation needs, and different needs from their community. So I think we were looking at this as something that could be adaptable, but generally taking back some space from cars, whether it's through removing parking or taking the entire street for people, to enable commercial districts to return to some amount of their former vibrancy. That's what we were thinking about.
I guess I wonder, like thinking about Park Lane, I know where this is. You know, it's very much in the downtown. It's already quite a slow street. There's a pretty high density of shops, you know. So it does seem like a logical way to help boost those small businesses. But thinking about in Seattle, a lot of the places where you have a similar density of shops, they're also some of the most gentrified areas in the city. Some of the highest rents for both businesses and residents. And so I do think that there's a little bit of an optics issue here where that would naturally be like close. Well, Pine Street's currently closed, not by the city, but close those areas of. I mean, of course, the density is there, but there are many pockets of neighborhood small businesses that are arguably struggling much more at this time than those that are in the Pike Pine core. Are we going to close streets for them too? Like what are we? How is this going to be allowed to be distributed equitably throughout the city? I mean, it's a real question, I think.
It only works if it is distributed, I think. That was where we were coming from. We're definitely very cognizant of the issues around gentrification. And again, that's why you have to think about the context. But it doesn't necessarily mean a full street closure. It means enabling some of those businesses to operate with more space. So they take over some space of the street that has been previously dedicated to cars. Anyway, stop talking.
You're here to talk, Megan. Come on now. Chris, is there anything that you wanted to say?
I mean, maybe even just thinking about where are other types of services that typically have people congregating that may not be businesses, for example. I would say, for example, libraries. Libraries are going to need to operate very differently. Could we start usurping some of the asphalt space for what would have typically been an indoor, very, there's so many things that happen at libraries. Libraries are like one of my favorite community resources. There's like story time, there is play time, there is all kinds of time, there's like rolling around time. And so we might need to think about these service locations that isn't a restaurant, that isn't a bar. Now maybe gyms are going to have to take place outside, so we should be a bit more expansive to think about who and what kinds of services are going to need to open up space in order to get back into business.
Yeah, there's a real like danger of I'm not saying that we shouldn't support small businesses, but like there's how do you prioritize? Like what if everyone's on the same street, right? Right now in Seattle we've prioritized curb space for pickup drivers.
Right.
So where does that go? I mean, I don't actually see that going down a lot when you now that you're dining in the street, you still in Washington, we're still going to be at 25% capacity, I think. So yeah, there's a lot of competing needs here. And I agree. I think at a community level, yes, some restaurants and shops hold a community importance that is central to that neighborhood, but libraries are arguably at least or more important. And there's lots of other examples of things like that.
All right, I'm going to go over to Margaret's question here. How can we improve road quality in communities that have grocery deserts? In Portland, we have a lot of sections of low-income communities with unpaved roads and no street lighting, but those same roads are used by students to walk to school. In winter, it's not safe in the morning and it's often very muddy. If they can get to paved sidewalks, they have to walk past strip clubs, etc. How, as citizens, can we get cities to improve these communities, even if only by paving streets? It's a tough one.
Well, I know in Seattle we have a problem that the north half of our city, not the north half, the north portion of our city was, it became a part of Seattle as the last part, and a lot of those neighborhoods don't have sidewalk, and it becomes a big question when you start to put, you know, we want to put a neighborhood greenway through this. You know, ostensibly a neighborhood greenway is for bicycling and walking, but now you have a street that doesn't have sidewalk. So we've seen the SDOT do things like come out to the community actually and say, well, we don't have enough money for a real sidewalk, a concrete sidewalk, but we only have enough money for 1 block, but we can build 13 blocks of asphalt sidewalk, and we'll paint it to look like concrete, for example. So that doesn't do it for everybody, but I mean, at least they're thinking a little bit outside the box. I mean, I wonder about the specific point that you say about like maybe even just paving streets. I mean, to me, if the road quality is poor, motorists are likely to not be traveling as fast. And if people are walking on the street, that's very important that they aren't traveling very fast. I mean, I think we know that the higher the speed of the vehicle, the you know, the likelihood of serious injury or death goes up tremendously. So yeah, it's interesting. I think if you're going to have people walking in the street, if you're going to legalize that in some way, if you're going to, you know, put in a advisory shoulder, which is a hot topic in transportation, or if you're going to just put in a temporary kind of asphalt sidewalk, like you have to have traffic calming.
This idea of not having enough money to build sidewalks kind of makes me mad. I it's kind of the least you can do. It's the first thing you should do is consider the most vulnerable users first. I remember I was putting up signs for Walk San Francisco, the annual Day of Traffic Death Remembrance, and I was walking between 2 very distant points. I happened to walk through the Alamany projects. It was late at night, it was dark anyway, but I realized very suddenly that this neighborhood didn't have sidewalks, didn't really have a spot to park. There were massive fences up everywhere. There was a bus that God knows how often it comes through. Basically no infrastructure, but they are surveilled. They have a massive, one of those systems that's like a generator with a floodlight and cameras. And I can't understand that being right next to a neighborhood like Bernal Heights, which has, in spite of this insane topography, paved sidewalks. It's all about who you know and whether or not you have a voice to the city. The people don't walk there is not a reason not to build it. I really think we just need to fundamentally rethink that. And I think people are suddenly starting to realize that in their communities, this fundamental lack of infrastructure is unacceptable, or at least I hope so. I don't know what the answer is, except to hold these people accountable and show up as much as you can. But some of these communities don't have people to show up.
Chris, if you want to speak, otherwise I'm going to go to our last question. Last question? All right, we're going to take the question from Jorge. We're going to circle back to slow streets here. It seems that slow streets are mainly planned as recreational corridors and due to their location and length don't work as movement or access routes. Do you think slow streets can have a real impact on active mobility trends? If so, how?
Who wants to go first? Yeah, I mean, I think when they, I mean, I'm guilty of this when I have two closed streets, open streets next to where I live. Thanks. Next to where I live, and it was fantastic when those were put in for me personally, because I really started running again during the pandemic, and I felt like it was very awkward to run. I was actually running in the street already because it was a very awkward interaction with people on the sidewalks, and so I really appreciated that. But these I live in the Central District in Seattle, and these go through historically Black neighborhoods, gentrifying neighborhoods in some cases, and you know, you feel that when you're in these streets. You feel like no one else is using the street. You're just this white person jogging through. So I kind of felt like the emphasis was too much on the recreation needs to begin with. Conversely, by closing streets that were the neighborhood bikeways that were already part of a transportation network, there was a bit of a network effect that in Seattle that was created. I mentioned earlier, I would argue that the fundamental nature of the street actually didn't change. They were already designed for through traffic to be discouraged. So like, I actually think from day one, when these were put out there, you could have set it up in a similar way. You could have messaged to folks that you're not supposed to drive more than one block on this street. I mean, that's how they were designed. It just wasn't, that wasn't the communication. So I think in that way we've done okay, but our limitation has really been on the network, or the lack of network. We use neighborhood greenways to supplement bike lanes and separated bike lanes. And so when you only close neighborhood greenways, you've actually just got a very patchwork network. And then if the idea is that a cyclist would use that open street and go over to a bike lane, then you haven't actually created the same kind of network for a person walking. But is that necessary? I don't know. Like, I just don't know. I don't know that these open streets should be transportation facilities. I think we have the or we're working on the transportation facilities. So I'm unsure. Jorge.
Chris or Megan, do you have any strong views?
I mean, no strong views, but I think the purpose, we have to be really clear about the purpose of slow streets. It wasn't to create, you know, long lengths of networks so that you could flow beautifully through it uninhibited by automobile traffic. I think the quick response and the solution that was proposed and implemented was really for an emergency release valve for people who felt stuck in their homes. So being really clear about that, because if we had looked at movement and access routes as the original goal, then slow streets would look very different. We would have chosen very different streets. They would always have destinations that were places to go to. So I think, again, not relying on slow streets to solve these bigger issues, although I think what it does do is actually spur a little bit of imagination locally about what is possible. So I would say that it would have that effect. And if anything, you know, in Oakland, we've actually repurposed those A-frames to be more like message boards. That is about filling out your census form. There are free COVID testing sites all throughout the city of Oakland. Go get tested. I mean, so we're starting to see like kind of interesting ways of utilizing our roadway space as for different purposes. So I think it encourages a little bit of creativity, but again, you know, really judging the success of your project based on its intended purpose is one thing, but also if we had the ability to really think about like what the true objective is. The true objective is safety, for people to feel safe on the street. The slow streets might have looked a little bit differently in different neighborhoods. It's a little twist to your question. Sorry, I didn't really answer your question, but I like twisting your question to fit my response.
All right, Megan, do you have a closing remark on this?
Oh, just that it's in our hands to change things, change the status quo, and that we should demand better from our infrastructure. And that's part of what slow streets are, I think, for now. But it's going to be something different tomorrow.
And Jorge, personally, I'm more about road diets, or I'm trying to change that to right-of-way optimization projects to specifically bring in space for active mobility and reducing on-street parking in some areas, or reducing the actual width of the right-of-way. Okay, it is 5:30. I cannot thank everybody enough for joining us in this discussion, and huge thanks to Chris, Megan, and Craig for joining me on this adventure. We've had a lot of good times kind of chatting and prepping for this in advance. So thank you so much for your time, and thanks to Walk Oakland, Bike Oakland. Look them up online if you've never heard of them. Thanks to Toole Design, ARUP, and SERA for allowing us to take the time to have this discussion today. All right. Thanks again, everybody.
Thanks, Erica.
Thanks,
All right.
Erica. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.